June 15, 1944, 6:47 a.m. Saipan, Mariana Islands. Lieutenant Commander Yoshio Yamada crouched in his fortified bunker, listening to intercepted American radio transmissions through his headphones. As Chief Signals Intelligence Officer for the Japanese 31st Army, he'd spent 3 years breaking American codes, predicting American movements, and giving Japanese forces the advantage of knowing enemy plans before they were executed. But this morning, something was wrong. Terribly wrong. The American radio traffic was incomprehensible. Not encrypted in the traditional sense, he could hear the voices clearly, speaking what sounded like a language but not English. Not Japanese, not Chinese, or any Asian language he recognized. The syntax was strange. The phonetics were unlike anything in Japanese code-breaking manuals. "What language are they speaking?" his assistant asked, frantically flipping through identification guides. Yamada had no answer. For 3 years, Japanese cryptanalysts had successfully intercepted and decoded American communications, using sophisticated cipher-breaking techniques developed by Imperial Japanese Navy intelligence. They'd predicted American movements at Coral Sea, Midway, and dozens of Pacific battles by reading encrypted American messages. But now, 6 hours into the Saipan invasion, American forces were coordinating massive amphibious assaults using a language Japanese intelligence couldn't identify, couldn't decode, couldn't break. Radio operators were calling in artillery strikes, directing troop movements, and coordinating air support in real time, all in a language that didn't exist in any Japanese military database. This must be a new machine cipher, Yamada concluded. Americans have developed encryption equipment we haven't seen before. Alert headquarters that we cannot decode enemy communications. We're fighting blind. What Yamada didn't know, what Japanese intelligence would never discover during the war, was that he wasn't hearing machine encryption. He was hearing Navajo language, spoken by American Marines from the Navajo Nation who'd volunteered to become code talkers, men whose native language would become the only code the Japanese military never broke. Within hours, American forces coordinating through Navajo Code would be directing artillery strikes with precision Japanese forces couldn't predict, couldn't intercept, couldn't counter. Within days, Saipan would fall, partially because Japanese commanders were operating without the intelligence advantage they'd relied on since Pearl Harbor. This is the story of how the Navajo Code Talkers transformed Pacific warfare, how prejudice prevented Japanese intelligence from recognizing the threat, and how Japanese officers' dismissal of primitive tribal language became one of their war's most catastrophic intelligence failures. To understand why Japanese officers dismissed the Code Talkers, you need to understand Japanese signals, intelligence dominance in the Pacific War's early years, and the arrogance that dominance created. Japanese military cryptanalysts were among the world's best. They'd successfully broken American diplomatic codes before Pearl Harbor. They'd intercepted and decoded American naval communications during early Pacific battles. They'd established comprehensive signals intelligence networks across the Pacific that gave Japanese commanders advanced knowledge of American operations. The Imperial Japanese Navy's Signals Intelligence Section employed over 4,000 personnel by 1942. They used sophisticated mathematical analysis, captured code books, and traffic pattern analysis to break American codes with remarkable speed. Their successes were significant. Battle of Coral Sea, May 1942. Japanese intelligence partially decoded American communications, giving Admiral Takagi advance warning of American carrier positions. Battle of Midway, June 1942. Japanese intelligence failed to realize Americans had broken Japanese codes, but Japanese cryptanalysts were still reading some American communications. Guadalcanal Campaign, 1942 to 1943. Japanese intelligence successfully predicted several American reinforcement convoys by decoding American operational messages. This intelligence advantage created institutional confidence bordering on arrogance. Japanese signals officers believed their cryptanalytic capabilities were superior to American equivalents. They dismissed the possibility that Americans could develop codes Japanese intelligence couldn't break. Commander Tatsuzo Okuda, leading Japanese Navy cryptanalyst, expressed this confidence in a July 1942 report. American cryptographic systems are predictable and vulnerable to mathematical analysis. American military communications follow patterns we can exploit. American signals discipline is inferior to Japanese standards. We maintain significant advantage in signals intelligence that contributes to operational success. This advantage will continue as long as American forces rely on machine ciphers we can analyze. This confidence was both justified and catastrophic. Justified because Japanese cryptanalysts were genuinely skilled. Catastrophic because it blinded them to the possibility of communication security based on language rather than mathematics. Japanese intelligence training emphasized breaking machine ciphers, complex encryption systems using mathematical algorithms. They'd studied European cryptographic systems, they'd captured American code machines, they'd developed sophisticated techniques for frequency analysis, pattern recognition, and statistical code breaking. But they'd never considered that the most unbreakable code might be a human language that existed nowhere in their reference materials. A Native American language spoken by fewer than 30,000 people, most living on a reservation in Arizona and New Mexico. The Navajo Code Talker program began with one man's idea and grew into the Pacific War's most successful communication security program. Philip Johnston was the son of missionaries who'd worked on the Navajo reservation. He'd grown up speaking Navajo fluently, one of only about 30 non-Navajos who could speak the language. In early 1942, he proposed to the U.S. Marine Corps that Navajo speakers could create an unbreakable battlefield communication system. The Marines were skeptical initially. Using Native Americans as code talkers wasn't new. It had been tried in World War I with limited success. But Johnston demonstrated something remarkable. Navajo language had characteristics that made it perfect for battlefield codes. Navajo language characteristics. Complex syntax completely unlike Indo-European languages. Tonal language where pitch changes meaning. No written form standardized enough for outsiders to learn. Vocabulary concepts that required complete cultural context to understand. Spoken by fewer than 30,000 people, almost all on one reservation. No Japanese linguists had ever studied it. No published Navajo-Japanese dictionaries existed. Grammatical structure made it nearly impossible for non-native speakers to learn as adults. The Marines conducted tests. They gave Navajo volunteers messages to encode and transmit. They timed how long it took compared to machine encryption. The results were stunning. Navajo speakers could encode, transmit, and decode messages in 20 seconds that would take 30 minutes using standard encryption machines. And the code was completely unbreakable without knowing Navajo language. The first 29 Navajo recruits arrived at Marine Corps Recruit Depot Camp Pendleton in May 1942. They underwent standard Marine training, tough enough that several recruits didn't complete it, then began developing the actual code system. The code talkers didn't just speak Navajo on the radio. They created a specialized military vocabulary using Navajo words metaphorically. Military term Navajo code word. Fighter plane hummingbird dahetihi. Bomber buzzard J-show. Battleship whale lotso. Submarine ironfish beshlo. America our mother Nehima. Grenade potato animasi. Major gold oak leaf gatanba. They also created a Navajo phonetic alphabet for spelling out words that had no Navajo equivalent. English letter Navajo word English translation. Awolachi ant. Bishushbear. Semoasiket. DB deer. Zibeshtugliz zinc. The system was ingenious. Even if Japanese intercepted transmissions, they would hear Navajo speakers using words like ant and bear and whale in sentences that made no literal sense. Without knowing both Navajo language and the specialized military vocabulary, decoding was impossible. Private First Class Chester Nez, one of the original 29 code talkers, described the system's development. We created a code within a language that almost nobody outside our tribe spoke. We used our language to talk about military things that didn't have Navajo words, so we invented them. We made our language do things it was never designed to do. And we did it in ways that only Navajos who'd been trained in this specific code could understand. It was like creating a secret language inside a secret language. The Navajo Code Talkers first saw combat during the Guadalcanal campaign in August 1942, but their impact remained limited because so few were deployed. The real test came at Bougainville in November 1943, where Code Talkers proved their worth decisively. At Bougainville, 6 Navajo Code Talkers handled over 800 messages during the first 48 hours of the invasion. Japanese forces had established extensive signals intelligence networks on the island and had successfully intercepted American communications during previous operations. But when Code Talkers began transmitting, Japanese intelligence achieved nothing. Major Howard Connor, signals officer for the 5th Marine Division, who had 6 Code Talkers working with his unit, made the definitive assessment. Were it not for the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima. But at Bougainville, the success was already evident. American forces coordinated complex amphibious operations, called in artillery and air support, and directed troop movements, all in real time, all without Japanese forces predicting or countering their actions. Japanese Lieutenant Commander Masahiko Takahashi, signals intelligence officer at Rabaul, recorded his frustration in reports captured after the war. November 3, 1943, American communications during Bougainville invasion employ unknown language or cipher system we cannot break. We intercept transmissions clearly but cannot decode them. The language is not English, not any European language in our references. Traffic analysis suggests these are tactical communications, fire support requests, troop movements, supply coordination. We are blind to American tactical operations for first time since war began. Recommend immediate priority to identifying this communication system. The immediate priority recommendation went nowhere because Japanese intelligence had no framework for understanding what they were hearing. Their training emphasized breaking mathematical ciphers. They had linguists who spoke English, Chinese, Russian, and European languages. But they had absolutely no one who spoke Navajo or who even knew Navajo language existed. Japanese attempts to break the code focused on the wrong approaches. They assumed it was a machine cipher they hadn't encountered, a variation of English disguised phonetically, a new allied code system requiring captured codebooks, something they could break through mathematical analysis. None of these assumptions were correct. The code talkers weren't using encryption. They were using a language that existed outside Japanese intelligence's entire conceptual framework. The Saipan invasion in June 1944 was the largest Pacific operation to that date. Japanese forces had months to prepare defenses. Japanese intelligence had been monitoring American communications from Pearl Harbor and other bases, trying to predict invasion timing and location. But when the invasion began June 15, 1944, Japanese forces on Saipan experienced something unprecedented: complete inability to decode American tactical communications. 21 Navajo Code Talkers participated in the Saipan operation. They handled all tactical radio communications for the assault waves, artillery fire coordination, infantry movement orders, naval gunfire support requests, airstrike directions, supply requests, casualty evacuation. Everything went through Code Talkers. Lieutenant Commander Yoshio Yamada, in his bunker monitoring American radio traffic, was experiencing professional crisis. His entire career was built on signals intelligence. He'd successfully predicted American movements at Guadalcanal. He'd helped plan Japanese defensive positions based on intercepted American communications. But now, he was useless. His report to headquarters, captured after Saipan fell, revealed his desperation. June 15, 1944. American invasion communications employ unknown system we cannot decode. We intercept clear voice transmissions but cannot understand language or determine meaning. This is not machine cipher. Human voices speaking unknown language clearly. Not English, not Chinese, not Tagalog or any Pacific language we've encountered. Phonetic patterns suggest North American indigenous language. But we have no linguists with such knowledge. Recommend capture of American radio operators for interrogation. The recommendation to capture code talkers was issued multiple times during the war. Japanese intelligence understood that the key to breaking the code was capturing someone who spoke it. But code talkers were protected aggressively. They operated with bodyguards, often other Marines assigned specifically to prevent their capture. And they carried orders to protect the code's security at all costs. Private First Class Joe Kiyomiya was a Navajo Marine captured at the Philippines. Japanese interrogators, learning he was Navajo, tried to force him to decode intercepted transmissions. But Kiyomiya hadn't been trained as a code talker. He spoke Navajo, but he didn't know the specialized military vocabulary the code talkers had created. When he couldn't decode the messages, Japanese interrogators assumed he was lying and tortured him. He survived the war but suffered lasting trauma from the experience. The inability to break the code had operational consequences. At Saipan, American forces coordinated complex multi-unit operations in real time that Japanese defenders couldn't predict or counter. Artillery strikes hit Japanese positions with precision that suggested Americans knew Japanese defensive locations, which they did, because code talkers were directing fire based on real-time intelligence Japanese couldn't intercept. Japanese commander Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito found his forces constantly reacting to American movements they couldn't anticipate. His defensive strategy relied partially on predicting American actions through signals intelligence. When that intelligence vanished, his entire defensive approach collapsed. Saipan fell after 3 weeks of brutal fighting. The Code Talkers had been one contributing factor among many, but their contribution, enabling American forces to communicate securely in real time, was significant enough that Marine commanders requested more Code Talkers for every subsequent operation. Japanese intelligence's response to the Code Talker problem revealed both their sophistication and their ultimate limitations. They correctly identified that Americans were using a Native American language. Traffic analysis and linguistic examination of phonetic patterns suggested North American indigenous origins, but identifying the specific language proved impossible. Japanese intelligence compiled a list of possible languages: Cherokee, Choctaw, Comanche, Sioux, Apache. They captured American prisoners and interrogated them about Native American languages used in military. Most American prisoners had no idea Code Talkers existed. The program was classified. Those who knew anything knew not to reveal it. Japanese intelligence even broadcast appeals in English, asking American Native Americans to defect, offering safety and good treatment in exchange for explaining the communication system. No Code Talkers defected. The appeals failed. Most frustratingly for Japanese cryptanalysts, they were hearing the transmissions clearly. This wasn't a case of signals being too weak or garbled. They had perfect reception, they just couldn't understand a word. Commander Tatsuzo Okuda, whose confidence in Japanese cryptanalytic superiority had been absolute, wrote a reassessment in September 1944. American forces employ communication system based on indigenous North American language unknown to Japanese linguists. System appears to be Navajo or similar Athabascan language group. No Japanese personnel speak this language. No dictionaries exist in Japanese. No linguistic references available for study. Mathematical cryptanalysis is impossible because this is language, not cipher. We cannot break this system without native speaker cooperation or extensive linguistic research requiring resources we do not possess during wartime conditions. Recommendation: accept that this communication system is unbreakable. Focus intelligence resources on other American communications that remain vulnerable. The admission was devastating. Japanese signals intelligence had maintained advantage through most of the war. Now they were recommending abandonment of efforts against entire category of American communications because they literally couldn't understand the language. But even this recognition came too late. By September 1944, Code Talkers were operating throughout the Pacific. Every major Marine operation used them, and Japanese forces were operating without intelligence they'd previously relied upon. The Battle of Iwo Jima, February-March 1945, demonstrated Code Talkers' contribution at its maximum. The battle was brutal, close-quarters fighting, where real-time communication meant the difference between success and catastrophic casualties. 13 Code Talkers operated at Iwo Jima. They worked in shifts, transmitting continuously for the operation's 36-day duration. They handled over 800 messages in the first 48 hours alone, coordinating the most complex amphibious assault in Marine Corps history. Major Howard Connor's assessment that, were it not for the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima, reflected operational reality. The ability to communicate securely in real time allowed Marine commanders to direct artillery fire onto Japanese positions without revealing American positions through radio intercepts. Coordinate multi-battalion maneuvers without Japanese forces predicting movements. Call in airstrikes and naval gunfire with precision targeting. Request supplies and reinforcements without Japanese forces intercepting logistics information. Coordinate casualty evacuation without revealing unit strengths and locations. Japanese forces defending Iwo Jima were fighting blind. They couldn't intercept meaningful tactical communications. They couldn't predict American movements. They couldn't prepare defenses based on intelligence about American plans. Private First Class Chester Nez, operating as a Code Talker at Iwo Jima, described the intensity. We worked 24 hours straight sometimes. One Code Talker would transmit while another rested, then we'd switch. Messages came constantly: fire missions, troop movements, supply requests, casualty reports. We were handling communications that, in previous battles, would have taken 30 minutes per message using encryption machines. We did it in seconds, speaking our language, using our code. Japanese forces couldn't understand us. We could hear them trying to jam our frequencies sometimes. But jamming doesn't help if you can't decode anyway. Japanese forces at Iwo Jima attempted technical countermeasures. They jammed American radio frequencies with noise. They transmitted false messages in English, trying to confuse American operators. They attempted to triangulate American radio positions for artillery targeting. None of it mattered. Code Talkers simply changed frequencies and continued transmitting. The secure nature of their communications meant Japanese jamming was merely annoying, not operationally significant. And targeting radio positions was difficult when transmissions were short and operators mobile. The battle for Iwo Jima cost 26,000 American casualties, 6,821 killed, but achieved strategic objectives. Code talkers contributed by enabling coordination that minimized casualties where communication breakdowns could have caused even more. Okinawa, April to June 1945, was the final test of code talker effectiveness. It was also the battle where Japanese forces made their last desperate attempt to counter Navajo communications. Japanese intelligence at Okinawa knew code talkers would be operating. They'd had months to prepare. They'd studied recordings of Navajo transmissions captured at previous battles. They'd compiled extensive analyses of phonetic patterns, attempted vocabulary lists, and traffic analysis data. It was all useless. During the Okinawa campaign, code talkers transmitted messages coordinating a 180,000-man invasion force, logistics operations supporting hundreds of ships, and tactical operations involving multiple Marine and Army divisions. The volume of communications was staggering, and all of it was secure from Japanese interception. Japanese commander Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima found his intelligence staff unable to provide the communications intercepts they'd provided in earlier battles. His defensive strategy, like strategies before it, was undermined by inability to predict American movements through signals intelligence. The most desperate Japanese attempt to break the code came in May 1945. Japanese intelligence used Korean prisoners, reasoning that some Korean linguists might have knowledge of obscure languages. They played recordings of Navajo transmissions and asked if the language was recognizable. Korean linguists identified the sounds as possibly Native American, but couldn't identify the specific language or provide any translation. Japanese intelligence was back where they started, knowing it was a Native American language but unable to do anything with that knowledge. By this point, Japanese military leadership was accepting that they'd lost the communications security war permanently. Priority shifted to other intelligence methods: observation posts, prisoner interrogation, captured documents. Signals intelligence, once a major source of operational intelligence, had become nearly useless against American tactical communications. Behind the operational success were Navajo men who faced prejudice from their own military while serving their country with distinction. Code talkers faced discrimination throughout their service. Some were mistaken for Japanese soldiers and nearly shot by fellow Marines who didn't understand there were Native Americans serving. They couldn't discuss their work. The program was classified. They received no special recognition during the war. Their contribution remained secret. Private First Class Joe Kiyumiya, the Navajo Marine captured in the Philippines, suffered torture because Japanese interrogators believed he was lying when he couldn't decode code talker transmissions. He survived the Bataan Death March, Japanese prison camps, and interrogation that left him with permanent injuries. After the war, he returned to the Navajo reservation, unable to discuss what he'd endured. The Code Talker program remained classified until 1968. For 23 years, his suffering had no public recognition because acknowledging it would reveal the program's existence. Private First Class Harry Sosi served as Code Talker throughout the Pacific Campaign. He returned home to Arizona in 1945 and was denied service at a restaurant because of no Indians policies still legal at the time. He'd fought for a country that gave him citizenship in 1924, but still discriminated against Native Americans in 1945. The psychological burden was significant. Code talkers knew their language, their traditional culture that American government had tried to suppress through boarding schools and forced assimilation, had contributed to defeating Japan. But they couldn't tell anyone. Their families didn't know. Their communities couldn't celebrate their service. And some carried guilt for surviving when other Marines died. Corporal Henry Bake Jr. transmitted coordinates for artillery strikes that killed hundreds of Japanese soldiers. After the war, he struggled with PTSD, unable to discuss his service, unable to find healing. The Code Talker served with distinction despite receiving no special recognition during the war. They'd volunteered to serve a country that had systematically oppressed Native Americans. They'd used their language, which American government schools had forbidden them from speaking, to help win the war. And they did it knowing they'd receive no public acknowledgement. After the war, the Code Talker program remained classified. The Marines believed Navajo code might be useful in future conflicts. Code Talkers were told not to discuss their service. Many returned to the Navajo reservation and spent decades unable to explain what they'd done. The classification meant no public recognition of their contribution, no inclusion in Marine Corps histories, no medals or decorations specific to Code Talker service, no acknowledgement in Native American communities, no historical record for decades. This silence was particularly painful because Code Talkers had contributed significantly but received none of the public honors other Marines received. Their families knew they'd served but didn't understand how. Their communities couldn't celebrate them appropriately. The program was finally declassified in 1968, 23 years after the war ended. Only then could Code Talkers discuss their service publicly. Only then did historians begin documenting their contribution. Only then did the American public learn that Native American language had created the only code the Japanese military never broke. Even after declassification, recognition came slowly. The first Code Talker Day on the Navajo Reservation was celebrated in 1971. The first congressional recognition came in 1982. The first congressional gold medals weren't awarded until 2001, 56 years after the war ended. Many Code Talkers died before receiving public recognition for their service. Of the 420 Navajo Code Talkers who served, only a few dozen were still alive when congressional gold medals were finally awarded in 2001. Chester Nez, one of the original 29, lived until 2014. He spent his final decades telling the Code Talker story to schools, museums, and military audiences. His message was consistent. We didn't fight for glory, we fought because our country needed us. We used our language, which some Americans had tried to make us forget, to help our country win. We're proud of that service even though recognition came late. After the war, Japanese military officers learned about the Code Talkers program and reacted with a mixture of respect and frustration. They'd lost the cryptographic war to a solution they'd never imagined. Former Commander Tatsuzo Okuda, the cryptanalyst who'd assessed Navajo code as unbreakable, wrote in his 1952 memoir, "We broke American machine ciphers repeatedly during the war. We decoded their operational plans. We predicted their movements. But we never broke Navajo code because we approached it as cryptography when it was actually linguistics. We assumed Americans were using sophisticated encryption when they were using simple communication in a language we didn't know existed. Our failure was one of imagination. We couldn't conceive that Native American language could be more secure than machines." Former Lieutenant Commander Yoshio Yamada, the signals officer at Saipan, wrote in 1969, "When I finally learned after the war that Americans had used Navajo language for tactical communications, I was simultaneously impressed and embarrassed. Impressed because it was an elegant solution, using linguistic obscurity rather than cryptographic complexity. Embarrassed because we'd spent years trying to break a code that wasn't technically code at all. We dismissed Native Americans as primitive based on racial prejudice common in Imperial Japan. That prejudice blinded us to recognizing that their language could be more effective than our sophisticated cryptanalysis. The Japanese military's failure with Code Talkers became a case study in intelligence failures caused by prejudice and assumptions. Japanese intelligence was sophisticated enough to break machine codes but not flexible enough to recognize that the most effective security might come from human language rather than mathematical complexity. Post-war Japanese military academies studied the Code Talker program as an example of asymmetric advantage, where one side's unique resource, Navajo speakers, created an insurmountable problem for the opponent. The lesson was that technological sophistication doesn't guarantee intelligence superiority. June 1994, Saipan, Mariana Islands. 50-year anniversary of the invasion. The U.S. Marines hosted a commemoration attended by American and Japanese veterans. Among them were 3 surviving Code Talkers and former Japanese intelligence officer Yoshio Yamada, now 78 years old. Through interpreters, they shared their perspectives on the battle that had showcased Code Talkers' contribution. Former Private First Class Chester Nez, 73, spoke first. 50 years ago, I crouched in a shell hole on this island, speaking my language into a radio, coordinating Marine operations. I knew Japanese forces were listening but couldn't understand me. I felt pride that my language, which the American government had tried to make me forget in boarding school, was helping my country win. That pride sustained me through the war and through decades of not being able to discuss what I'd done. Former Lieutenant Commander Yamada responded, 50 years ago, I sat in a bunker on this island, listening to you speak, unable to understand a word, watching my intelligence capability vanish. I was frustrated, confused, professionally humiliated. Now I understand. You used your cultural heritage as a weapon we had no defense against. Not because we weren't smart, Japanese cryptanalysts were very skilled, but because we never imagined Native American language could be a security system. Our prejudice made us blind to the threat. Former Corporal Henry Bake Jr. 71 added, I transmitted coordinates that directed artillery fire onto Japanese positions. I knew I was causing deaths, but I was doing my duty, using my language to protect my fellow Marines. After the war, I struggled with guilt over the killing and frustration that I couldn't discuss my service. This commemoration, being able to finally tell the story publicly, provides some closure. A younger Japanese attendee, grandson of a Japanese soldier killed at Saipan, asked the Code Talkers, "Do you feel your language should have been used for killing?" Chester Nez answered, "My language is sacred to Navajo people. Using it for war was a difficult decision. But we were in a war we didn't start. We used what we had to help our country survive. I don't apologize for that. I honor my language by using it well, even in war. And I teach it to young Navajos now so it survives for peace." The ceremony concluded with both Americans and Japanese acknowledging that Code Talkers had contributed to American victory through a unique cultural resource that Japanese intelligence had no framework to counter. Former Marine Corps Commandant General Charles Krulak delivered closing words. Code Talkers used their language, part of cultural heritage the American government had tried to suppress, to help America win the war. That's profound irony. The same government that sent Native American children to boarding schools to force them to forget their language later depended on that language for military advantage. We owe Code Talkers a debt not just for military service, but for preserving their language despite pressure to abandon it. That preservation became a strategic advantage at a critical moment. The Navajo Code Talkers' contribution to Pacific War victory was recognized officially only decades after their service, but their impact on military communications security was immediate and lasting. Final statistics. Navajo Code Talker Program 1942 to 1945. Total Navajo Code Talkers who served 420. Original Code Talkers who developed the system 29. Major operations with Code Talker participation 21. Messages transmitted hundreds of thousands. Code-breaking attempts by Japanese continuous throughout war. Successful Japanese decodes 0. Operational impact. Speed advantage over machine encryption 10 to 1, 20 seconds versus 30 minutes. Accuracy rate, nearly 100%. Security, never broken by enemy forces. Contribution to operations. Considered decisive at Iwo Jima and significant at all major Pacific battles. Recognition timeline. Program declassified 1968, 23 years after war ended. First congressional recognition, 1982. Congressional gold medals awarded 2001, 56 years after war ended. Navajo Code Talkers still living at time of medal ceremony, 4 of original 29. Japanese intelligence failure. Resources devoted to breaking Navajo Code, extensive. Progress achieved, none. Impact on Japanese defensive operations, significant. Loss of signals intelligence advantage. Post-war assessment. Case study in intelligence failure due to cultural assumptions. The story of the Navajo Code Talkers is ultimately about how cultural diversity can become a strategic advantage and how prejudice creates intelligence blind spots. Japanese officers dismissed American Code Talkers initially because Imperial Japanese ideology didn't respect Native American cultures. They assumed primitive tribal language couldn't be a significant military asset. They approached the problem with sophisticated cryptanalytic techniques designed for breaking machine ciphers. They failed completely because they were solving the wrong problem. Navajo code wasn't machine encryption requiring mathematical analysis. It was human language requiring cultural knowledge Japanese military simply didn't possess. Lieutenant Commander Yoshio Yamada had listened to Code Talkers transmitting on June 15, 1944, and concluded it must be a sophisticated machine cipher. He'd approached the problem with all the tools of Japanese cryptanalytic sophistication. He'd failed not because Japanese intelligence was incompetent, but because his framework for understanding the problem was wrong. The irony was profound. Japanese military had successfully broken American machine codes but couldn't break Native American language code. Technology lost to culture. Sophistication lost to linguistic obscurity. Mathematical analysis lost to the simple reality that Japanese military didn't know Navajo language existed. Chester Nez and his fellow Code Talkers had volunteered to serve a country that had systematically oppressed Native Americans. They'd used their language, which American government schools had forbidden, to help America win the war. They'd done so knowing they'd receive no recognition because the program was classified. They'd served anyway because it was their country, their duty, and their opportunity to prove Native Americans' patriotism and capability despite decades of discrimination. Their language, preserved against pressure to assimilate, became America's secret weapon. The cultural heritage American government had tried to erase became the communications security system that Japanese military never broke. The lesson extends beyond World War II. Cultural diversity is a strategic asset, not a weakness. Languages that seem primitive or obscure can provide advantages sophisticated technology cannot. And prejudice, assuming some cultures are inferior, creates blind spots enemies can exploit. Japanese officers dismissed code talkers based on prejudice about Native Americans. That dismissal cost them the signal's intelligence advantage they'd maintained since Pearl Harbor. That loss contributed to Japanese defeats across the Pacific. The code talkers proved their worth in every major marine operation from Guadalcanal to Okinawa. They transmitted messages in seconds that would have taken 30 minutes using encryption machines. They enabled real-time tactical coordination impossible with slower communication methods. They provided communication security Japanese military never penetrated. And they did it while facing discrimination in their own military, serving a country that had oppressed their people, using a language American schools had tried to make them forget. Their service demonstrated that patriotism and capability transcend discrimination, that cultural heritage can become military advantage, that languages preserved against assimilation pressure can prove strategically decisive. Japanese officers dismissed code talkers until American secrets vanished overnight. Then they spent the rest of the war trying to break a code that wasn't code. It was language they'd never heard, spoken by people whose culture Japanese prejudice had dismissed as primitive. The dismissal was a strategic mistake. The prejudice was an intelligence failure. And the vanishing secrets were the result of America using its cultural diversity as a weapon Japanese military had no defense against. The code talker served with honor, received recognition belatedly, and proved that the nation's strength comes from its diversity, even diversity that prejudice tries to suppress. Japanese officers learned too late that dismissing enemies based on cultural prejudice is a path to defeat. The code talkers taught that lesson one transmission at a time, speaking their language, protecting their code, contributing to victory that proved cultural heritage is strength, not weakness.